All right, so we're going to be in Luke chapter 15 tonight. We're going to go over verses 11 through 32, if you want to turn there. So before we start reading it, just to kind of get into the passage, the feel of it, if you imagine, if you have kids, it'll be easier to imagine, but just imagine that you have kids and one of them comes to you and says, hey, I want my share of, the inheritance. We don't really use that word anymore, but, when parents die, everything gets divvied up, and they say, hey, Mom and Dad, I want half the cost of the car and the house and your savings and all of that. I want you to pay all that out to me, and then after you've given that to me, I'm going to not talk to you anymore. Just don't really want to be in your life anymore. So if you could just pay me what I'm due, I'll leave. We'll never see each other again. How would you feel if they came and said that to you? I think most of us would probably not respond particularly well. And so that's what we're going to kind of see initially here in our passage tonight. So this ties back to the beginning of Luke 15 that Zach taught last week. So Jesus is going to tell a parable here in our passage this evening, and it's the third in a series of 3 parables, so it's the last one. And he's telling these parables in response to something that the Pharisees and the scribes brought up. So at the beginning of chapter 15, in the first few verses there, we see Jesus eating and spending time with tax collectors and sinners. And the Pharisees and the scribes, they grumble and complain about this. They're like, why is Jesus spending time? They're not happy that he's hanging out with these tax collectors and the sinners. And so Jesus responds to their complaints, to their grumbling, with 3 parables. So last week, Zach went over the parable of the lost sheep and the one of the lost coin. And then tonight, we'll see Jesus' third parable, the longest, kind of most in-depth one here, that we typically call the prodigal son. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump in and read. So it'll be chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. All right. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, Look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. And he said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found.'" All right. So now we'll go ahead and go back through and look at all of it. So in verses 11 and 12, we see there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger one said to his father, "Father, give me the share of property that's coming to me." And he divided the property between them. So a pretty insulting thing to do to the father, especially if you look at that culture. They had a lot of respect for their parents, and we see that a lot in the commands of the Old Testament as well. So we've been going through Genesis, and we can even see through Genesis on Sundays that Abraham, he was the head of his wife and all of his children, and even when his children had children, they were still under him as the head. They had hired servants, members of their household that he was over, and they all went where Abraham went. We see that with, I just mixed Abraham and Jacob up, but you know what I mean. With Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, Jacob's sons all followed him. So the father was the head of everybody. They were like a little king over their own small kingdom there. So they were shown a lot of respect. And then when we get to the 10 Commandments with Moses, one of those commandments is to honor your father and mother. And in that commandment it says, "Honor your father and mother that your days may be long, that you may have a long life, and that it may go well with you in the land." So there's a positive result shared for honoring your father and mother. And then we won't turn there, but in Deuteronomy 21, if you want to turn and check, you can. There is a section there in their laws where if somebody had a disobedient son, if it was they say a stubborn and rebellious son who wouldn't obey despite being disciplined, then his parents were to bring him to the elders and show that he's a rebellious drunkard and glutton. And what they would then do, they would stone the son to death. They would kill him for his kind of disrespect and irreverence for his parents. So respecting your parents was very big in this culture, a very big deal. And so this son came up and basically said, "Dad, you're dead to me. Can I have what I'm due, and I'll go ahead and leave?" And back then, it's not like we had banks today and we put all our savings in there. It wasn't really like that. Most of their wealth was tied up in their land. So it would have taken effort for the father to divvy all that up. He might have had to sell a portion of the property, which would have affected his livelihood. It would have brought dishonor on him to send his son out like that. The expected response to something like that would have been for the father to, beat the son and drive him off with nothing and say, "Get out of here and don't come back." But here in the story, we see the opposite reaction from the father. Instead of driving his son out, saying, "Don't come back here, you're going to leave with nothing," he instead obliged his son. He went ahead and divvied up what was due to the son and let him depart with what he had asked for. So then in verse 13, we see that son leave. He gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. So we know this parable as the prodigal son, and it's that word reckless there. In other translations, it's translated prodigal, which just means like profuse expenditure. So it means like lavish or recklessly spendthrift. There we go. And so he eventually comes to an end there and hits rock bottom. In 14 through 16, we see that he spent everything, and then a severe famine arose in the country. And so he was in need at that point because he had nothing left. And so he hired himself out to a citizen of that country and ended up feeding pigs. And in the Jewish culture, they weren't allowed to eat pork. The animals were considered disgusting, so this would have been pretty degrading. He really hit the lowest of the low. He wanted the pig's food even. And so in verses 17 through 19, we see that now that he's hit rock bottom, he has a change of heart. When he says to himself, he came to himself and said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." And so here we see, he says hired servant, and I think this is a good part to highlight. He's speaking to himself, so I think it seems like he's really repentant here. It's not like he's just devising a plan to get ahead. It seems like he's really hit the bottom, and he really does want to turn things around and come back to his father. And here it says hired servant, contrasted to a few verses later where we'll see when the father calls a servant. He uses two different words. So later, when the father calls a servant and the older brother speaks to a servant, the word, my Greek is not good. I think it's pais, but it means like a servant that's a member of the household. So he's like kind of part of the family, would travel around, he would live on the property and be taken care of by the father. But the hired servant here, it's mistheos, which is more like somebody employed for hire. So someone that gets hired out to do a job, but isn't necessarily under the household of the father. So the son's saying, like, I'm not worthy to be your son. I'm also like not even worthy to be a part of your household. Will you just give me a paycheck so I can eat? So he's really humbling himself when he returns to the father there. And so he had a plan and a repentant heart. And so with that, he returned to the father. And again, we see the father respond in the opposite way than we expect. So in verses 20 through 24, "And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate." So we might have expected the son to come back and, the father to be standing at the porch like, "Oh, now he's coming back. Like, what's he want this time?" Kind of expect him to grovel and whatnot. But the father sees him, and he just runs towards him. He has them bring the best robe. That would have been the father's robe. And put his own robe on his son's back, puts a ring on his finger, gives him shoes to wear. So he receives him enthusiastically. The guy who wished he was dead, he receives lovingly and graciously and enthusiastically. And one thing that struck me, he doesn't even let him finish apologizing. We see in the previous verses, the son, he's readied his speech. He's going to give the speech to the father, and he gets partway through it, and then the father interrupts him, and he's like, "Bring the best robe." Like, he doesn't even let the son finish kind of groveling and repenting. Mid-process, he's already forgiven him and graciously received him again. So he fully reinstates him as an heir. He calls him my son. So he's fully accepted him, not as a hired servant, not as just a servant in the household, but as his child, he's received him again. And then he has them kill the fattened calf. They didn't have a whole lot of these, and you don't get a calf fat overnight, so this was a really special occasion here, and he was announcing to the whole neighborhood, everybody around would have known, oh, they've got some sort of event going, and so people probably knew that the son had disgraced him, taken part of his share and left, and that might have caused some dishonor for the father. And then suddenly that son is back, and the father's celebrating and lavishly, prodigally spending money to rejoice in the return of his own son, pulling out the fattened calf and all the stops to celebrate the return of his child. So we see in verses 11 through 24, this part of the story about the younger son. Jesus is answering the complaint of the Pharisees in a similar way that he did in the first two parables. So we see that the son departed at cost to the father, and the father took the son back at further cost to himself. So the son did not pay the price for his own restoration. The father paid all of it. And so the forgiveness was free to the son, but it was costly to the father. The father, he gave up wealth, He may have gotten a damaged reputation from both the son's leaving and his receiving him back. But regardless, he's celebrated anyways. And the son didn't even get to make a show of his own repentance. And so we see here this lines up with with the first parable of the lost sheep when Jesus says that heaven rejoices when one sinner repents. So he throws a big party and his whole household is rejoicing at the return of his son there. And so this part of the story might depict many of us. I think in my earlier years in life, I might have resonated more with the younger son. But this parable goes further than the first two. In the first two parables, the coin was found, the sheep was rescued, and the end. But here, Jesus is going to keep going because he's addressing the Pharisees. That's who he's telling the stories in response to. And here, in the first two parables and the first part of this one, he shows heaven's attitude towards a repentant sinner. But now he's going to turn and address the heart of the Pharisees, the ones who he's telling the story for. And so this is the story of two lost sons. So the first son, the younger son, depicted the tax collectors and the sinners that the Pharisees were upset Jesus was spending time with. And then this older son is going to depict the scribes and the Pharisees. So to go back to the intro, we kind of imagined ourselves as a parent having a child come to us and say those things. So to take a different perspective in that story, imagine yourself as a child and you see your sibling, your little brother, little sister, somebody come to your mom and dad and do what this son did in the story. And how would that make you feel if your parents received that from your younger sibling, and then they went ahead and gave a portion of everything to them, and they were like, yeah, you can just take it and go. How would you feel in that situation if you saw your sibling do that? And how would you respond if that's what was happening in your family there? And then, to further that, if you saw that sibling come home and your parents not act out against them, but instead throw a party and invite the whole neighborhood and pull out all the stops to celebrate their homecoming, how would you feel in that moment as well? So in verses 25 through 27, we see the older brother's response. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound. So initially we see the brother didn't even go in. He came back from the field and saw there was something happening, and he's the oldest son, he's the heir. He had every right to walk in and find out for himself what was going on. He could have gone to his father and been like, hey dad, what's all this for? And then he would have seen his brother there. He definitely could have done that, but instead of joining, he stayed outside and called a servant over to him and was like, hey, I want you to tell me what's happening in there. We see that in a similar scene in Matthew chapter 9, verse 11. We won't turn there, but in a similar scene, the Pharisees, they're upset about Jesus spending time with tax collectors and sinners, and they grab Jesus' disciples, and they ask the disciples, why does your teacher spend time with these tax collectors and sinners, instead of joining in and spending time with Jesus and asking him themselves? And so the brother stays outside, the servant gives him an answer, and then in verse 28 we get to see his response. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But this son of yours, who has devoured your property and property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. So the older brother chooses to respond to his father's mercy and his father's grace with anger. He refused to join in the feast that his father was throwing. But then we get to see how his father responds to him. In verse 31, he says, and he said to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. So despite his attitude, his father still responds graciously to him as well. He still pleads with him to enter into the feast. The dad could have gone off on him and been like, "You're so ungrateful. Like, why aren't you glad that your little brother is home?" But the father doesn't take that attitude with him either. So we see the son is angry, and we see he even tells us like why he's angry. He says that he's never disobeyed his father's command. The father doesn't contradict him, but I can't think of anybody who didn't disobey their parents at one point or other in their lives. So the father could have contradicted him right there, but he did not. Steve hasn't disobeyed. Cool. But yeah, so the father could have called him right there, like, "Well, buddy, like I've got a little list here of ways that you've disobeyed me throughout your life. You might not be as righteous as you think you are." But the older brother, he tries to, bolster himself. He displays his own righteousness. He's self-righteous and prideful before his gracious and merciful father. He even goes so far as to fault his father for showing mercy and grace. He tells his father it's wrong of him to show this mercy to the younger son who squandered his wealth. But why is he concerned about what happened to his father's wealth? He's selfishly motivated there as well, because he gets upset that the father killed the fattened calf for him, but what he's really worried about, "You never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends." He's concerned about what is his, like the share that he gets out of it. And so he's like, "Look what my brother got. Like, I didn't even get a little bit, and I've never disobeyed you. Like, I deserve the fattened calf. You haven't even given me a goat." And so in this, we see that his little brother showed remorse for his evil deeds, while he chose to show pride for his good deeds. And one thing that really stuck out to me here, he doesn't even call him his brother. When he's talking to the father and going off on the father for showing grace and mercy, he says, "Your son." He doesn't say "my brother." He wants nothing to do with him. He doesn't want to consider him family or acknowledge him that way at all. And so we see that's very much Jesus addressing the heart of the Pharisees. They were Jews, just like the tax collectors and sinners Jesus was spending time with. They were all considered children of God, and the Pharisees did not want to be associated with them. They were the older brother that didn't want to acknowledge the little brother. Older brothers, the older siblings are supposed to help and teach the younger siblings, and this older sibling wanted nothing to do with showing the younger sibling the right way here. It's very similar to how Jesus addressed them when he rebuked them in chapter 11 a number of weeks ago, when he told them that they're like a cup that's clean on the outside, but filthy on the inside, full of greed and wickedness, despite their righteous display on the exterior. But in the end here, in verse 31 and 32, he says, "Son, you're always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, and this your brother was dead." Here the father says, "Your brother," not my son. He says, "Your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and he is found." And we saw previously that the father was pleading with him to come in. And so the story, it ends right there. We don't see how the older brother responds in this parable because Jesus leaves it open-ended. He's sharing this parable in response to the complaints and the grumbling of the Pharisees, and he leaves off the response of the older brother because he's putting it out there for the Pharisees. He's saying like, "Look, these sinners, these tax collectors, they're repenting and seeking to join in God's kingdom. And I want you guys to come and hang out with us and celebrate with us too." And he leaves it open-ended like that to see if they will accept his invitation. So Jesus wants both groups, the sinners and tax collectors, as well as the Pharisees and the scribes, to join in his feast. He's inviting everybody, whether they've sinned very blatantly and flagrantly, very obviously, like the younger brother, or whether they've displayed kind of more subtly, sinned internally with pride and judgment and different things like that. He's inviting everybody, regardless of what we've done, to join in the feast. And so I feel like I relate more as I've gotten older to the Pharisees there, the older brother in that story, because as I've gotten older, I might not do as many obviously foolish things that I did when I was like younger in college or my early 20s. But I feel like I'm definitely more prone to catching myself like, oh, like I'm a Christian and I follow Jesus and I like do that by doing X, Y, Z. But like that guy over there doesn't really do that. And it can be tempting to slip into judgment. And Jesus warns a lot about this when he talks about, don't call out the speck in your brother's eye before you've addressed the log in your own eye. He tells us to pardon so that we will pardon, and judge so we will not be judged, and tells us to be merciful as our Father is merciful. And here he's calling the Pharisees to that again. He's telling them to rejoice in the repentance of their brothers as they come to the Lord. So whatever we've done, God sees us as his children. So he could have driven us off. When that son came back after squandering his father's wealth, the father could have said, "Get out of here, like, you're gone. You know what you did." And then when the older brother responds to him very disrespectfully as well, he could have been like, "Fine, if you don't want to celebrate the return of your brother, you can leave too." He could have kicked both of them out, and he chose not to in either case. At great cost to himself, God forgives us. He shows us mercy and grace and invites all of us to join his feast. So he wants to join his feast, and he wants us to celebrate one another. He wants us to rejoice when sinners find repentance and experience the mercy and grace of our Father. So with that, go ahead and turn around to a couple of the people next to you, and we'll go ahead and spend some time praying together. As we can pray that we would extend the grace and mercy of God to each other, that he extends to us. And we can pray that we would not let our own pride or our own judgment of others keep us apart from God, and that those we know who are living like the younger son would return to the Father.